Hello and welcome everybody to the latest in my Cambridge iGCSE English language exam top tips, helping you prepare for the exams which are coming up just next month. Today's top tip is tip number 4. Timing isn't everything, but it is important. So it's really important that you have a clear idea of how you're going to allocate your limited amount of time to the various assessment tasks on the paper. In general, for most exams, the advice is to follow the mark a minute rule. That is, allow yourself 1 minute for each mark the question is worth. So a 3-mark question should require 3 minutes to complete, for example. With English, however, time for reading the stimulus texts is already built into the overall time available. I have included a guide below, which I'm going to go through in a moment, on how long to spend on each assessment task. But you can always adjust timings as needed or borrow time from short answer and or comprehension questions to use for the extended response task, the longer task on paper 1. My middle daughter, for example, used to devote considerably more time to the extended response task than was suggested, but then fly through the comprehension and short answer 1 markers last of all. And that has the added advantage that if you do run out of time, you've only potentially lost a couple of marks on the short answer questions, rather than losing a chunk of marks on the extended response task, which carries the most marks of any task on the paper. So my guide is as follows. For text, the questions based on text A, I recommend usually spending approximately about 25 minutes on that. So that's for your comprehension questions at the beginning of the paper, on paper 1, spending around 25 minutes on that. Those questions are linked to and based on text A. For the questions which are linked to text B, that's the summary task. You want to spend around about 25 minutes. Again, remember, these are just guidelines. What works for you may be slightly different depending on where your strengths are and how challenging or how straightforward you find various tasks, where your strengths lie and where you struggle. So text C, that is far and away, the questions that are based on text C carry the most marks of all questions on the paper. So I always recommend spending around 1 hour and 10 minutes on that. So that includes the 2 longer tasks, the writer's effects question and the extended response task on paper 1. So let's look at a more detailed breakdown now. So for question 1, there's short answer questions based on text A. I recommend spending around 22 minutes up to 25 minutes, but you may find it takes you a lot less than that. For the summary writing task based on text B, around about the same amount of time again. And the short answer questions based on text C, that's your writer's style questions, worth 10 marks. For that, I recommend spending about 15 minutes. And then the language analysis task, that's your writer's effects question. Spend about 22 minutes on that for your 15 marks for that. And then we have the last task on paper 1, the extended response writing task, which I recommend spending around about 35 to 40 minutes. As I said, you may find that you want to spend more time on that. You want to devote more of your time to that and take time off the amount of time you want to allocate for your short answer and questions for question 1, question 2, for example. So experiment and see what works for you and figure out what timings suit you best. But the advice is always to use your time wisely. For paper 2, it's a bit more straightforward. We only have 2 tasks, the directed writing task question 1, that's 40 marks out of 80. And question 2, that's a descriptive or narrative composition task. That's also worth 40. So they're equally weighted on this paper. And each of those tasks contributes to your grade, equally representing 25% of your overall grade. So worth spending time looking at these tasks. We'll be looking at that in another exam top tip in a couple of days' time. But it's always recommended, and be clear on how much time you have remaining. Keep an eye on the time in the exam. It's easy for time to get away from you and to then suddenly realize with a shock that you have too little time left and you're rushing to try and get it all completed. So also remember, in addition to that, that watches are no longer allowed in exam rooms. So make sure before you begin that you can see the clock, and to let the invigilator know if you can't, so you can be moved somewhere where you can see the clock, because you need to be able to see the clock in order to keep a track of the time you have remaining. Another tip is not to get bogged down too much with any particular question. Know when to cut your losses and move on, as the trade-off between the amount of time you're spending trying to get that 1 or 2 extra marks and the marks that you could stand to gain from doing that might not be worth it. So know when to move on. And the last tip I have for you is to practice, practice, practice. English is a skills-based subject, which means that unlike other subjects which just often require memorization of facts and regurgitation of details in exams, with English, you really want to practice those skills. And the more practice papers you do, the more mock papers you do, the stronger you'll feel on all the skills and assessment tasks, the more confidence you'll have, and the better placed you'll be to go into the exam hall ready, feeling confident. Right, so those are my top tips on how to use your time and spending your time wisely during the exam. A reminder that you can still purchase my Cambridge iGCSE English Language exam preparation course, which has all the tips and advice you'll ever need and covers all the key assessment criteria and the skills for success, with past paper assessment walkthroughs and exemplars to illustrate good responses, so that you've got a really clear idea of what examiners are looking for and how to produce effective responses under exam conditions, plus loads of top tips and advice for you. Stay tuned for another Cambridge iGCSE English Language top tip coming soon.